I never thought a 6-year-old would be the reason I had to cut my best friend of 10 years out of my life like a malignant tumour. You'd think after a decade of loyalty, shared secrets, and enough memories to fill a library, there'd be some level of mutual respect, right? But what do you do when the person you thought you knew becomes a complete stranger? Someone who looks at your boundaries and sees them as a personal attack. It started with a small change, a new face in the circle, but it ended with a scorched earth fallout that left an entire social group in ruins. I'm sitting here now, looking at old photos of us, and I have to ask myself, how did we get here? Was it the kid, or was it the person he chose to become the moment he stepped into that new life? I'm 29 now, and for a solid third of my life, Y was my shadow. We were those guys, the ones people expected to be at every party together, the ones who had a shorthand language of inside jokes that no one else understood. We'd survived the chaos of our early 20s, the grinds of first jobs, and the slow evolution into actual adulthood. My girlfriend, who I'll call Sarah, has been in the picture for 6 years. We've built a life together, a quiet, curated sanctuary in our apartment where we can finally breathe after a long week. We're 20-somethings who enjoy the finer, quieter things. We like our expensive coffee, our clean white rugs, and our peace and quiet. We've never been kid people. It's not that we hate them, we just don't want them in our immediate orbit. We chose a child-free lifestyle because we value the autonomy and the silence. You knew this. He'd known it for years. We'd had countless late-night conversations about the future, and he was always on the same page. Until he met Em. Em came into his life about a year ago, and at first we were happy for him. She was nice enough, and Y seemed genuinely head over heels. But Em came with a +1 in the form of a 6-year-old daughter. Now, I have respect for anyone stepping up to be a parent, and Y took to the role of stepdad with an intensity that was almost jarring. It was like a switch flipped in his brain. Suddenly, he wasn't just Y, the guy who liked craft beer and Halo. He was Y, the family man, and while that's fine for him, he seemed to forget that the rest of us hadn't signed up for the same transition. The friction didn't start with a bang. It started with a slow, agonizing creep. It began with the group hangouts. We'd all agree to meet at a local brewery or a restaurant that stayed open late, places that were distinctly adult. Then, 5 minutes before the meetup, Y would text, "Hey, bringing the little one along, hope that's cool." He never actually waited for an answer. He'd just show up with Em and a 6-year-old in tow. At first, we all tried to be polite. We'd smile, say, "Hey," and try to ignore the fact that the dynamic of the night had just shifted from drinks and venting about work to censoring our language and watching a kid play games on a tablet with the volume turned all the way up. But it wasn't just the presence of a child. It was the total lack of boundaries. This kid, bless her heart, she's just a kid, had zero concept of personal space, and her parents were apparently allergic to the word no. I remember one specific Friday night. Sarah and I had invited the group over to our place. We'd just bought a new leather sofa, the kind of purchase you save up for and treat like a holy relic. We'd barely had it for a week. Y and M showed up, and before they'd even taken their coats off, the daughter was off like a rocket. She didn't just sit down, she launched herself onto the sofa with a handful of sticky crackers. I felt my stomach drop. I looked at Y, expecting him to say something, to maybe guide her to a chair or tell her to be careful. Instead, he just beamed at her. "She's got so much energy today," he laughed, as if her wiping orange dust onto my new furniture was a charming personality trait. That night was a turning point for Sarah and me. Throughout the evening, the kid was everywhere. She grabbed my phone off the coffee table and started scrolling through my photos. When I gently took it back, she didn't just stop, she lunged for it again, laughing while Em just watched from the kitchen island, sipping wine. Then came the pets. We have 2 cats who are essentially our children. They're rescues, and they're very skittish around loud noises and sudden movements. This kid started chasing them under the dining table, screaming at the top of her lungs, trying to grab their tails. I saw my cat's ears go back, the universal sign for, "I'm about to bite someone," and I had to physically intervene. "Hey, why?" I said, trying to keep my voice light but firm. "Can you have her settle down a bit? The cats are getting really stressed out." Why didn't apologize. He didn't even look embarrassed. He just shrugged and said, "She's just playing, man. They'll get used to her. It's good for them to socialize." Socialize? They're cats, not toddlers at a daycare. But that was the pattern. Every time we met up, the environment had to be sanitized for her. We'd suggest a movie night, and Y would say, "Can we do a Disney movie? She's really into Encanto right now." We'd suggest a bar with a great patio, and he'd counter with a park or a family-friendly bistro where the food was mediocre, but there was a plastic slide in the corner. Slowly, our entire social identity as a group was being dismantled to accommodate a child who wasn't even ours. It wasn't just the logistics, it was the entitlement. Y and M acted as if her presence was a gift we should all be grateful for. They never asked if it was okay to bring her. They just assumed the world revolved around her schedule. If we wanted to do something after 8 p.m, Y would complain that it was too close to her bedtime and ask if we could move it to 2 p.m. on a Saturday. Our weekends were being hijacked. Sarah and I finally hit our breaking point after a particularly disastrous dinner at our place, where the kid managed to knock over a glass of red wine and then proceeded to have a full-blown meltdown because we didn't have the right kind of juice. After they left, the silence in our apartment felt heavy. Sarah looked at the stain on the rug and then at me. "I can't do this anymore," she said. Her voice was flat, exhausted. "This isn't our life. I feel like a stranger in my own home when they're here. I don't want kids in our house, period. Especially not a kid who isn't being parented." I knew she was right. I felt the same way. But Y was my best friend. How do you tell your best friend of 10 years that his new family dynamic is suffocating you? I thought I could handle it with a calm, rational conversation. I thought our history meant that he would at least try to understand where I was coming from. I was so incredibly wrong. A few days later, Y called me to talk about plans for the upcoming weekend. I decided this was the moment. I took a deep breath and told him, as gently as I could, that Sarah and I had talked it over and we wanted our apartment to remain an adult-only zone. I explained that we valued our friendship with him and M, but we weren't comfortable with kids in our home anymore. I thought I was being clear and setting a healthy boundary. There was a long silence on the other end of the line. I expected a, "Oh, I get it," or maybe a, "Sorry, we'll get a sitter next time." Instead, the voice that came back was cold, defensive, and laced with a bitterness I'd never heard from him before. "You're serious?" he asked. "You're actually banning a 6-year-old because you're worried about your stuff? She's my daughter now, man. If you don't want her there, you clearly don't want me there." "It's not about banning her, Y," I tried to explain. "It's about our space. We aren't kid people. You know this. We've always been this way. It's nothing personal against her. It's just how we want to live." But he wasn't listening. He started arguing, trying to convince me that I was wrong for my preferences. He told me I was being selfish, that I needed to grow up and realize that life changes. He treated my boundary not as a request for respect, but as a moral failing on my part. The conversation ended in a stalemate, with him hanging up on me. And that was just the beginning. The real storm was brewing, and it was headed straight for Sarah's birthday. The silence that followed that phone call was deafening. It wasn't the kind of silence that suggests a cooling-off period. It was the heavy, charged silence that precedes a massive storm. For the next few days, I felt like I was walking on eggshells. Every time my phone buzzed with a notification from our group chat, my heart would skip a beat. I'd look at the screen, expecting another barrage of insults or a passive-aggressive comment. But for a while, there was nothing. We had gone completely dark. It was as if he'd vanished from the digital world we'd built together over the last decade. Sarah noticed it too. She saw the way I'd stare at my phone, the way I'd sigh and put it back down without saying a word. She knew how much wise friendship meant to me, but she also knew where we stood. We talked about it for hours, circling the same drain. We weren't the villains here. We were just two adults who wanted to maintain a space that reflected our lifestyle. Why was that so hard for him to accept? Why did our friendship suddenly have a child-required entry fee? As the days turned into weeks, the tension within our broader group of friends began to simmer. We'd all been a tight-knit unit for years, and now there was this glaring, unspoken rift. The others, none of whom had kids, were starting to feel the squeeze too. They'd mention, in private conversations, how exhausted they were by the constant shifts in plans to accommodate Y and M's daughter. They were tired of the family-friendly breweries and the early afternoon hangouts that felt more like a playdate than a social gathering. But no one wanted to be the first to say anything. No one wanted to be the bad guy who told a father his child wasn't welcome. Then came the planning for Sarah's 28th birthday. Sarah had been looking forward to this for months. She'd had a rough year at work, and she wanted a night that was purely about fun, relaxation, and being surrounded by her favourite people. We decided to host it at our apartment. It was going to be a sophisticated affair: cocktails, a high-end catering spread, and a curated playlist that definitely didn't include Baby Shark. It was her night, and she wanted it to be perfect. When it came time to send out the digital invitations, we had a long discussion about how to phrase the guest list. We knew Y and M would be the only ones who might try to bring a child, but we didn't want to single them out. At the same time, after everything that had happened, we needed to be crystal clear. We didn't want any misunderstandings or last-minute, "we couldn't find a sitter" excuses. Sarah drafted the invite carefully. She kept it light and celebratory, but at the very bottom, in clear, polite language, she wrote, "This will be an adults-only event. We love your little ones, but we're looking forward to an evening of grown-up fun. Thank you for understanding." I read it over her shoulder. "Is that too much?" she asked, her thumb hovering over the send button. "No," I said, though a part of me was already bracing for the impact. "It's our home, Sarah. It's your birthday. If we can't set boundaries for our own celebration, when can we?" She hit send. The response from the rest of the group was immediate and positive. "Can't wait! Count us in! So excited for those cocktails." For a few hours, I thought maybe I'd over-prepared for the worst. Maybe Y had finally realised that his new life didn't have to consume every aspect of our shared social life. Then, my phone chimed. It wasn't the group chat. It was a private message from Y. I opened it, and my stomach did a slow, sickening flip. "Are you serious with this invite?" the message read. "A no kids rule. For a birthday party? That's incredibly rude, man. A sane person wouldn't write that on an invitation to their friends." I felt a surge of heat crawl up my neck. "A sane person?" I typed back, trying to keep my thumbs from shaking. "Why, it's Sarah's birthday. We've been over this. We want an adult evening. It's not a personal attack on you or your daughter. It's a preference for the event." "It is a personal attack," he shot back almost instantly. "You're basically saying my family isn't welcome. Em is incredibly hurt by this. She feels like you guys are looking down on her because she has a kid. And Sarah? Calling her hostile would be an understatement. This whole thing is making everyone uncomfortable." I stared at the word hostile. My girlfriend, who had spent the last year biting her tongue while his stepdaughter wiped sticky fingers on her furniture and chased her cats into hiding, was being called hostile for wanting a child-free birthday party? The audacity of it was breathtaking. "She's not being hostile, Y," I replied, my patience finally fraying at the edges. "She's setting a boundary for her own party in her own home. If you can't respect that, that's on you. We've been friends for 10 years, and I'm shocked that you're prioritizing a fight over a birthday invite over our entire history. But why wasn't finished. He started digging into Sarah personally. He told me she was cold, that she was trying to change me, and that she was the reason our friendship was falling apart. He accused her of being anti-family and said she was creating a toxic environment for the rest of the group. I was sitting on the sofa, the phone gripped so tightly I thought the screen might crack. Sarah was in the kitchen, humming to herself as she looked at cocktail recipes, blissfully unaware that her best friend was currently tearing her character to shreds in a series of blue and grey bubbles. I felt a profound sense of loss, but beneath it, a growing, white-hot anger. This wasn't the why I knew. The why I knew would have laughed about the no kids rule and made a joke about how he was looking forward to a night away from the chaos. This person, this version of why, was someone who viewed any boundary as a declaration of war. He was willing to sacrifice a decade of brotherhood because he couldn't handle the word no. I didn't reply right away. I needed to breathe. I needed to think. I looked around our apartment, the place we'd worked so hard to make our own. I looked at the spot on the rug where the wine stain had finally been lifted, a ghost of a conflict I thought we'd moved past. I realised then that this wasn't just about a birthday party. It was about respect. It was about whether or not why actually valued me as a person, or if I was just a background character in the new movie of his life, a character who was expected to follow the script he'd written. The messages kept coming. Why was now looping in M's feelings, telling me how disappointed she was in both of us. He was trying to guilt-trip me into backing down, into apologising to them for our rude behaviour. He even hinted that if we didn't change the rule, they wouldn't be coming, and that I shouldn't be surprised if others felt the same way. He was trying to stage a coup of Sarah's birthday. He was trying to turn our friends against us by painting us as the child-hating villains of the story. I looked at Sarah. She looked so happy, so vibrant, finally excited about something after months of stress. And I knew, in that moment, that I couldn't let this slide. I couldn't let him disrespect her like this. I couldn't let him bully us into submission in our own home. The snap didn't happen with a shout. It happened with a quiet, cold realization. I realized that the friend I had loved for 10 years was already gone. He'd been replaced by someone I didn't recognize, and someone I certainly didn't want in my life anymore. I began to type. I didn't hold back. I didn't try to be the bigger person anymore, because the bigger person was being trampled. I told him exactly how much his lack of boundaries had cost our friendship. I told him how disrespectful he'd been to Sarah, and how tired I was of the constant arguments and the pressure to conform to a lifestyle I never asked for. I hit send, and I felt a weight lift off my shoulders that I hadn't even realized I was carrying. But I had no idea that my message would be the spark that finally set the entire friendship group on fire. The message I sent was the digital equivalent of a nuclear strike. I didn't just defend the party. I dismantled the last 10 years of our friendship in a few paragraphs. I told him that my home wasn't a daycare, my girlfriend wasn't a punching bag for his insecurities, and that I was done, completely done, trying to fit into a life he'd built without any regard for the people who had been there since the beginning. I told him that calling Sarah hostile was the final straw, and that if he couldn't see how much he'd trampled over our boundaries for the last year, then he didn't know me at all. I ended it by saying that until he could show some basic respect for our life, he wasn't welcome in it. I hit send, and for a moment, the world went quiet. I didn't feel the rush of regret I expected. I didn't feel the need to take it back. Instead, I felt this strange, cold clarity. It was like I'd been carrying a heavy, jagged rock in my pocket for months, and I'd finally just dropped it. Sarah came into the living room then, holding 2 glasses of wine. She saw my face, the way I was staring at the phone, the tension in my jaw. She set the glasses down on the coffee table and sat next to me. "What happened?" she asked, her voice soft. I couldn't even look at her. I felt like I'd failed her by letting it get this far. I handed her my phone. I watched her face as she scrolled through the messages. I watched her eyes widen when she got to the part where Y called her hostile and cold. I watched her hand tremble slightly as she read my response. She didn't cry. She didn't get angry. She just let out a long, slow breath and leaned her head on my shoulder. "I didn't realize he hated me that much," she whispered. "He doesn't hate you, Sarah," I said, finally looking at her. "He's just so obsessed with this new identity of his that anyone who doesn't fit into the perfect family narrative is an enemy. He's using you as a scapegoat because he can't handle the fact that I'm the one setting the boundary." But the damage was done. The perfect birthday party she'd been planning now felt tainted. The joy of the celebration was being eclipsed by the shadow of a decade-long friendship ending in a gutter of insults. Then, the group chat exploded. I don't know if Y had screenshotted my message and sent it to everyone, or if he'd just gone on a rampage in the main thread, but my phone started buzzing incessantly. It was like a swarm of hornets in my pocket. I didn't want to open it. I knew what was coming. I expected our other friends to be caught in the middle, to try and play peacekeeper, or worse, to take his side because family comes first. But that's not what happened. Our friend Lucas was the first to chime in. He's always been the quiet one, the guy who avoids drama like the plague. "Look," he wrote, "I've been staying out of this, but why? You're out of line. Sarah's birthday invite wasn't rude, it was a heads up. We all love your daughter, man, but we're all adults. We're allowed to have one night where we don't have to watch our language or worry about someone's kid breaking something. You're making this way bigger than it needs to be." Then came Jen. "Honestly, Y, I agree. We've all been feeling the pressure to change our plans for months. We just didn't want to hurt your feelings. But attacking Sarah personally? That's low. She's done nothing but be a good friend to all of us." It was a landslide. One by one, our friends, the people Y thought he could rally against us, started speaking up. It turned out that Sarah and I weren't the only ones who had been feeling suffocated. Everyone had been quietly resenting the way our group dynamic had been hijacked. They'd been annoyed by the sticky fingers on their phones, the constant shifts to family-friendly venues, and the way Y and M acted like their child was the centre of the universe. Y didn't take it well. He went into a full-blown defensive spiral. He started accusing everyone of being anti-child, of being immature, and of not understanding real responsibility. He brought M into the chat, and she started tagging people, telling them how heartbroken she was that her daughter was being discriminated against. The entitlement was staggering. They weren't just asking for inclusion, they were demanding that the entire world revolve around their specific lifestyle choice. And when the group didn't immediately bow down and apologize, Y did the unthinkable. He started bringing up old secrets, things we told him in confidence years ago, trying to use them as weapons to discredit us. He was burning the village to the ground because he couldn't rule it. I watched the chat in horror. This was a man I'd shared everything with. This was a guy I'd bailed out of trouble, a guy I'd stayed up with until 4 a.m. when his first real girlfriend broke his heart. And here he was, throwing all of that history into the fire over a birthday party rule. "I'm out," Lucas finally messaged. "This is toxic. Y, I think you need to take a step back and look at how you're treating people. We're not the ones who changed. You are." One by one, people started leaving the group chat. Lucas has left the conversation. Jen has left the conversation. Mark has left the conversation. The silence that followed was different this time. It wasn't the silence of a looming storm. It was the silence of a graveyard. I looked at Sarah. She was still leaning on me, staring at the empty screen. "Is it over?" she asked. "I think so," I said. But it wasn't over. Not really. Because while the group chat was dead, the fallout was just beginning. Over the next few days, The reality of what had happened started to sink in. I'd lost my best friend. But more than that, Y had lost everyone. He'd pushed so hard, he'd been so convinced of his own moral superiority that he'd managed to alienate every single person who cared about him. I started getting private messages from the others. They all said the same thing. "I'm so sorry you and Sarah had to deal with that. We're still coming to the party. We've got your back." It should have felt like a victory. I'd been validated. My boundaries had been upheld. But I just felt a profound sense of sadness. I kept thinking about the before times. I thought about the road trips we took in college, the way we'd talk about the future, and how we'd always be the crew. We had this vision of growing old together, of being the crazy old men at the back of the bar. Now that future was gone. It had been replaced by a reality where I couldn't even look at a photo of him without feeling a knot of anger and betrayal in my chest. A week before the party, I got one last email from Y. It wasn't an apology. It was a long, rambling manifesto about how we were all living in a bubble, and how one day, when we finally grew up, we'd realize how much we'd hurt him. He told me he was moving on to find real friends who understood the sanctity of family. It was the ultimate "you'll be sorry" letter. But as I read it, I didn't feel sorry. I felt relieved. I realized that the person who wrote that letter wasn't my friend. My friend had died a year ago, the moment he decided that his new life required the total submission of everyone else's. The night of Sarah's birthday finally arrived. Our apartment was exactly how we wanted it. The lights were low, the music was a smooth, deep house mix, and the air smelled like expensive gin and wood-fired pizza. The cats were lounging on their tree, unbothered. The furniture was clean. There were no tablets blaring cartoons, no sticky fingerprints, no screaming. As our friends started to arrive, there was an initial moment of awkwardness. The elephant in the room was a 6-foot-tall shadow of a man named Y. But as the drinks started flowing and the conversation picked up, the tension began to melt away. For the first time in over a year, we weren't censoring ourselves. We weren't checking the clock to see if it was past a 6-year-old's bedtime. We were just us. But then, an hour into the party, there was a knock at the door. Everyone went dead silent. We weren't expecting anyone else. I looked at Sarah, and I saw the colour drain from her face. My heart started pounding against my ribs like a trapped bird. I walked over to the door, my hand shaking as I reached for the handle. I looked through the peephole, and my blood turned to ice. It wasn't Y. It was M. And she wasn't alone. I stood there, paralysed, my hand hovering over the cold metal of the door handle. Through the tiny fisheye lens of the peephole, the hallway looked distorted, like a scene from a fever dream. M was standing there, her face set in a mask of practiced tragedy, and gripped tightly in her hand was her 6-year-old daughter, who looked exhausted, clutching a crumpled handmade card. The music from the living room seemed to swell, filling my ears with a rhythmic thumping that matched the pulse in my neck. I looked back at the room. Sarah was standing near the kitchen island, her drink halfway to her lips, her eyes wide with a mix of fear and realization. Our friends had gone quiet, their conversations dying out like embers in the rain. They all knew. They all saw the shadow through the frosted glass of the side panel. I took a breath, trying to steady my racing heart, and cracked the door open just a few inches. I didn't want to let them in. I didn't even want them to see the party behind me. "M?" I said, my voice sounding foreign to my own ears. "What are you doing here?" M didn't even blink. She adjusted her grip on her daughter's hand and forced a tight, watery smile. "We just wanted to stop by," she said, her voice loud enough to carry into the room. "The little one made Sarah a birthday card. She's been talking about it all day. She didn't understand why we weren't coming to the party, so I thought we'd just drop it off." It was a setup. A cold, calculated move designed to make us look like the villains in front of everyone. If I turned them away, I was the heartless monster rejecting a child's gift. If I let them in, I was signaling that our boundaries meant nothing, that Y and M had won. We're in the middle of a party, I said, keeping my voice low and level. We were very clear about the no kids thing. This isn't the time. It's just 5 minutes, Em insisted, her voice rising an octave. She looked past me, trying to catch someone's eye in the living room. Surely you're not so heartless that you turn a child away at the door. She just wants to say happy birthday to Auntie Sarah. I felt a surge of pure, unadulterated coldness wash over me. Auntie Sarah? Sarah wasn't her aunt. Sarah was a person whose boundaries had been ignored for a year, whose character had been assassinated by Em's partner, and whose birthday was currently being hijacked for a power play. Before I could respond, Sarah walked up behind me. She didn't look scared anymore. She looked done. She stood tall, her hand resting firmly on my shoulder. Thank you for the card, Sarah said, her voice steady and clear. You can leave it on the mat. But like we said in the invite, tonight is an adults-only event. We're not hosting children tonight. Good night, Em. The look on Em's face shifted instantly. The sad mom persona vanished, replaced by a flash of genuine, ugly spite. You guys are unbelievable, she hissed. Y was right. You're both so selfish. You'll be alone in that perfect little apartment of yours forever, because you don't know the first thing about family. If this is what you call family, I said, finally finding my spine, then I'm perfectly fine being alone. Tell Y to stop sending his family to do his dirty work. This is over. I didn't wait for a reply. I closed the door. The click of the lock sounded like a gavel coming down. I leaned my forehead against the wood for a second, listening. I heard Em's muffled voice in the hallway, something about horrible people, and then the heavy retreat of footsteps toward the elevator. I turned around to face the room. Our friends were all staring at us. For a heartbeat, I worried I'd gone too far. I worried they'd think we were the hostile ones Y had described. But then, Lucas stood up. He walked over, took the empty wine glass from my shaking hand, and set it on the table. That was incredibly manipulative of them, he said, shaking his head. I can't believe they actually brought the kid here to guilt-trip you. Who does that? People who don't respect you, Jen added, coming over to give Sarah a hug. You guys did the right thing. Don't let them ruin the night. The rest of the evening was a blur of solidarity. We didn't talk about Y anymore. We didn't talk about the no kids rule. We just enjoyed the company of people who actually cared about our comfort. But as the last guest left and the apartment fell into that deep post-party silence, I felt a strange, hollow ache in my chest. 10 years. I'd known Y for 10 years. We'd been through everything together. And it had all ended because he couldn't accept that his new life didn't entitle him to rewrite mine. I looked at the crumpled card Em had left on the mat. I'd picked it up after they left. It was just a drawing of some flowers with happy birthday written in shaky 6-year-old crayon. My heart hurt for the kid, caught in the middle of a war she didn't understand, being used as a pawn by parents who should have known better. In the days that followed, the fallout was permanent. Y blocked me on everything. He deleted every photo of us from his social media. Our mutual friends told me he'd gone on a spree, unfriending anyone who had been at the party. He'd effectively nuked his entire social circle in 1 week of redirected anger. I heard through the grapevine a few months later that he and Em had moved to a different city. Apparently, he told people that he needed to get away from the toxic environment of our hometown. It's funny how people like that always think the problem is the environment and never the person they see in the mirror. Sometimes I still catch myself seeing something funny online and thinking, I should send this to Y. Then I remember the messages. I remember the look on Sarah's face when she was called hostile. I remember the feeling of that door closing. Was I the asshole? Maybe some people would say I was. Maybe they'd say I should have been more flexible or understanding. But at what cost? My peace? My partner's happiness? The sanctity of my own home? If being a sane person means letting people walk all over you in the name of family, then I'm perfectly happy being the villain in Y's story. Because in my story, I'm the person who finally learned how to say no. It's been a year now. Sarah and I are still child-free, still living in our quiet, curated sanctuary. We have new traditions, new friends, and a lot more peace. But I want to know what you think. Would you have let them in for those 5 minutes just to keep the peace? Or would you have closed the door like I did? When does being a good friend turn into being a doormat? Let me know in the comments. And if you've ever had to set a hard boundary with a friend who just wouldn't listen, share your story. I'd love to hear how you handled it. Don't forget to subscribe for more stories like this. Sometimes